Conergy's Canadian division. He's got more than 8 years of experience in this as well. So he's designed and managed a large variety of grid tie and off-grid systems here in Alberta and Ontario as well. In his 3.5 years as president, he's been instrumental in restructuring the company's business model, including its entry into EPC and project finance business lines in Canada. So this is vastly different from what it used to be. So I think we're forging new territory, which is always interesting. In addition to his management of Conergy's Canadian division, he also occupies the position of chair of the board of CanSIA. This is his second year in that position, so I believe it's first year, first term that he's doing it, but second year now he's the chair of the board, so I think that's pretty impressive. As the chair of CanSIA, Jared's responsible for overseeing the development of the association strategy and taking an active role in its policy and regulatory activities across all federal and provincial markets in Canada. His role at CanSIA has afforded Jared the opportunity to develop close ties with a variety of ministries and regulatory agencies across Canada. So, speaking for myself, I think he's a great ambassador for the industry, good networker, and really good to move the industry forward, and I think you'll see that as well. So he's a professional engineer with a BSc in electrical engineering from the University of Alberta. He also holds an MBA from the MacEwan School of Business from the University of Calgary. We're happy to have him here tonight, this evening. So, Jared, if you want to take the stage.
Thanks, Rael. And what Rael did mention is we met in second grade, third grade. Rael was actually the best man at my wedding, so our relationship goes back a long time, and it's a pleasure to work with people like him and a lot of recognizable friendly faces in the crowd today. One of the things that I've loved about my time in the solar industry over the last almost 9 years now is that it's one of the only spaces that I can imagine where your competitors are people who still enjoy spending time with and sit down having a drink with. And everybody in this space is so aligned and trying to move the industry forward collaboratively and together that it's a really tight community, which has been great. What I want to try and talk about today is just a very brief summary of Conergy, what we are, what we do. I'll do the same thing for CanSIA, but then I really want to talk about what's happening in solar. I've had the opportunity to talk to people about solar for 8-9 years now, and every time you go to have a conversation, it's a different conversation because the market changes so drastically. And we'll see some of that with regard to the price curves. And then what a lot of that it's going to lead to is a discussion around why I believe that solar is going to be critical for Alberta. We're going to talk about levelized cost of electricity in solar where it sits today, and then look at what that means as far as the current pool prices in Alberta, how it compares as far as competitive cost of electricity, and then go into a couple of interesting comments from some studies done in the northeast of the US, and try and close with what I believe it's going to take to bring more solar to this province. And I think that the context for all of this will be that solar is coming to Alberta. It's going to be in Alberta whether we prepare for it early or not. And we have a real opportunity now to ensure that we have the industry that we want and the infrastructure that we want when we look 20, 30, 40, 50 years out. So I'll give a very brief overview of Conergy. This is us. We're one of the longest standing solar companies in the space, 14 years of operation. We do, as Rael I alluded to in my bio, project finance, large-scale EPC. Our business here in Canada is primarily focused on engineering support, but mainly product support to a lot of people that are in the crowd today. We're one of the only solar companies that maintains a physical warehouse presence here in Alberta for the market. This is our current global footprint. Kyle Kozowski, who's in the crowd here today, was part of Conergy or ETI Solar as well when it was acquired by Conergy. And we used to joke at the time that the reason they bought Canada was so they could occupy a whole lot of land mass and look better on the global chart. But I think now we're seeing that there's other opportunities beyond that. I also have a dual role where I chair the board of directors for CanSIA. CanSIA is a Canadian Solar Industry Association, and we work in partnership with groups like CISA, who has the event put on tonight. But our focus as CanSIA is on the national solar market. So we try and look at markets all across. And we have about 650 members across the country, and we have roles in trying to advance policy, as well as supporting our members in some of the regulatory challenges that they have. And so I've just put a very quick slide on some of the things that are being worked on in Ontario, and as much as I don't like referencing Ontario for presentations in Alberta, especially being an Albertan, my work takes me to Ontario more than it has in the past, because Ontario has had a feed-in tariff program for the last number of years that's really driven and accelerated the growth of solar. But the reason I want to put this up is because it's not just feed-in tariff. I mean, if you look at this whole list of things that the association is working on, there's one that talks about feed-in tariff, and everything else is talking about the industry in general. So, long-term energy plan, how do we fit in from a long-term perspective as we have coal plants being decommissioned and coming offline in Ontario, and trying to decide what happens with nuclear refurbishments? What role does solar play in a generation gap? Conservation is another big one, especially when we start looking at solar thermal, but even small-scale solar PV. There's a difference of opinion in the industry as to whether small-scale solar should be considered generation or conservation, because for a large majority of systems, you're just offsetting consumption. So it can also be looked at as a demand management or conservation measure. Regional planning and siting, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but solar, as far as I can tell, is one of the easiest to site, most diverse technologies. And one of the huge values of the technology is that if you need 3 megawatts of generation over here, you put 3 megawatts of generation over here. You don't have to build in huge step functions. One of the challenges that a lot of industrializations have is when they look to refurbish generation fleets or build new generation, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure investment in one fell swoop. Whereas with solar, you can do small little incremental adjustments to balance generation requirements. And the rest is here, so I'm not going to go through any detail. Across Canada, we're working with the Alberta government, both with the Department of Energy as well as Sustainable Resource Development, around how solar is going to fit into what is continuing to be worked on under the Alternative and Renewable Energy Framework. It's work being done in Quebec and Nova Scotia. Outside of just the provincial work, there's things being done around standards and codes with CSA. There's some training things being done in partnership with NABCEP. So, it's a very broad base of things that are being worked on right now. So, solar, generally, there's a million different of these charts out there today. They all essentially tell the same story. We're somewhere around here, we're going to go to somewhere around here. How do we service our future energy demand? And the different colors and the percentages and the breakdowns are going to vary depending on who put this together. This is an older study that was published in Germany in 2009, but just showing at the time their perception of where solar PV would make up on the global basis as far as the amount of installed capacity and generation of electricity. But I won't go into details because it's all the same. Energy is increasing, we're using more energy all the time. How do we service this demand without having ridiculous amounts of GHGs? I find this interesting because this chart shows something very similar, increasing energy demand, but where this differentiates is it shows OECD versus non-OECD. And if we look at the OECD, we don't have a significant amount of growth in load in the developed nations because we have very significant infrastructure that's already been built out. Where we see significant load growth is in the non-OECD countries as we start seeing their economies improving, getting electrification out to areas where they haven't had it in the past, building grid infrastructure from scratch. So they're going from no load to significant load and increasing that dramatically. Right now, our largest project under construction, there's 2 or 3 of them, are in Thailand, 90 megawatts in size per project, because they don't have the generation infrastructure they need to support the growing market there. So some of the largest projects that are happening in the world today are in places like Thailand. We're starting to see more in places like the Philippines, because not only do they want to ensure that they have green electricity, they just need electricity in a lot of these areas. And we don't have that problem. You turn on your light switch, your lights come on here. This is the global installed capacity of solar. So I started the industry in 2005, and I don't show the chart because it wouldn't show up. 6 gigawatts is what the total installed capacity was. So over the history of time, in 2008, 6 gigawatts. The US market this year will install 5 to 6 gigawatts on its own in 2014, this coming year. So we're going from the entire installed capacity globally being 6 gigawatts a few years ago to one country, albeit a large one, but installing 6 gigawatts in its own in 1 year. Last year, we expected the global solar industry to actually contract below 28 gigawatts. When the IHS report came out, we actually installed 32. So we saw a consistent growth year over year. Even through recessionary times, austerity measures, we still see solar continuing to grow. And as we carry forward, we'll see what that means. But and why that's happening. But as we look forward and expecting, this is installed in 1 year on global installed capacity. So last year, there was 32 gigawatts. Total installed capacity to date is 100 gigawatts. But we look a couple years out, we're talking about 50 gigawatts in 1 year. So again, 50% again, what the total installed capacity is globally in 1 year, 2015. This chart shows where energy generation is going from just renewables generally. And the expectation from the IEA is that by 2018, 25% of our electricity, so this dotted line, 25% of the electricity generated globally will be done through renewable sources. And the interesting thing about this is that, and it doesn't break it down here, but historically, hydro has been the driving force in renewable generation. And it's still one of the best generation sources we have as far as being dispatchable and storable and everything else depending on the source. But the investments in renewables right now that are carrying us forward, and we're seeing the growth year over year, it's not large-scale hydro, it's primarily solar and wind that is causing this drastic increase in renewable generation globally. So there's been a paradigm shift with regards to renewables that it's gone away from things like hydro in the past and really focusing on things like wind and solar now. So what does this all mean? This graph aims to show LCOE versus energy tariffs in Europe. So LCOE is the levelized cost of electricity. And so what this is trying to show is if your graph right here for the LCOE is below your country, it is cheaper today to install solar than buy electricity from the utility provider. This is actually causing a huge amount of challenges in Europe. The different lines, and I'll tell you one in a minute, the different lines here have to do with different install prices. So €2 a watt down to €1 per watt. A euro today is around 1.3 to 1.35 Canadian dollars. So these are aggressive installation prices, but as I'll show later in the presentation, this is very easy to do in Europe because of the scale that's already being deployed. But what I find quite interesting, and obviously you look at this graph, and almost every country in Europe is what we would say in the money today to install solar as opposed to buying from the grid. In the time that I've been in this industry, so coming on 8 years, it's the first time we've ever been able to say something like this, where it is less expensive to buy solar than it is to buy your local electricity. Now, it's not quite the same case in Alberta. There's some reasons for that. Part of it's because we don't pay 25 euro cents per kilowatt hour like they do in Germany, which is 40 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. We pay less than half of that, including all of your transmission and distribution, which may change when we spend another $14 billion over the couple of years on transmission lines, but today, you pay a lot less than what they would pay in Europe. So this is quite interesting. What this is precipitating is that it's changing the way the European countries look at solar. Germany, Italy, Spain have been the drivers of renewable technology, and specifically solar, over the last couple of decades, and especially over the last couple of years. The industry is where it's at today because of Europe's leadership on cost. Rob was talking about earlier this year how Germany had 50% of its electricity on the grid for solar. I was actually in Germany that day. It was June 6th, and I was in Hamburg, and there was over 50% of the electricity generated or consumed that day was generated by solar. And they also, by the way, have the ability to consume almost 30% of their electricity from wind. So as an electricity systems operator, this is a very significant technical challenge. And we're starting to see issues in Europe now where they have a really difficult time integrating more solar or more wind because they have so much of this intermittent generation on the source. So much so that in Germany, there's incentive structures now for residential homeowners to install battery storage systems on their homes. And that their feed-in tariffs now pay less for anything you export versus what you self-consume. So they're trying to focus on factory conservation, consuming less as opposed to generating and exporting onto the grid. So it's presenting some interesting technical challenges. Now in Alberta, we have a peak load of 10.6 gigawatts, and we have total installed capacity of solar of less than 4 megawatts. So solar has no impact right now on how our grid functions. We'd have to see significant penetrations of solar for it to start to impact how the ASO has to plan the grid. But in Europe, it's a real issue today. So again, why is this happening? Well, here's a price curve just showing, this is just the commodity, the solar module itself. And if I ran this graph back 2 more years, you'd see this number double. So in 2008, 2009, we were looking at $4 a watt for solar modules. By 2010, we're down to $2 a watt. Today, this is wholesale factory gate prices, so less than you pay on a retail basis, but we're below $1 a watt. And so as these prices continue to come down, the cost of electricity that's generated from that also comes down in step. This is a report that was generated by Navigate Consulting. This is done in 2009, so a little bit old. But in 2009, we're showing installed costs of just over $5, and we're projected that by, let's just take 2018, we're going to be at $3 a watt. Today, for large-scale projects, we're seeing them as low as $1.75 a watt. Commercial rooftop projects, $3 a watt. Residential projects, depending on how simple they are, it could be $3.25 to $4 a watt. So even in the last 4 years, our price assumptions have fallen through the floor, and now we're at levels well below what we were expecting even a short time ago. So again, all of this precipitating significant increases in demand for the technology. Unfortunately, in Alberta, we don't have a lot of solar. We're seeing significant growth year over year. I think earlier today I learned we had 75% or 78% increase year over year in solar connected to the grid, which is great. But we have, by my estimates rather, around 3 megawatts of installed capacity in Alberta. So 78% year over year until now has been great, but we're starting from such a small base that it really doesn't make up a very significant amount. And the largest project on this picture, and these are old slides, but is actually an installation in BC. It's not an Alberta-based one. So there's a combination here of solar thermal, solar PV, there's some different technologies, many of which are here, or a couple of which are here in Edmonton. But we still have a long ways to go, 3 megawatts. When the AESO reports on generation, solar is in the other bucket, and there's nothing that indicates what it's from. So I live in Calgary, I work in solar for the last 9 years, but how do you make it work in Alberta? Well, it's difficult today. But I truly believe that there's an opportunity for things to change. I think there's some very key policy drivers that are going to precipitate change in this province. And those being social license, reducing GHG, and renewing infrastructure. And this is an early look at some of the research that CanSIA has put together in partnership with Pembina and some others. It will be released in more detail next week, and then a full report will come out at the end of October. So a lot of this information will be presented at the CanSIA Solar West conference, which is in Calgary next week. But I want to touch on each of these just very briefly in this discussion today. So this is a quote from Minister Oliver from earlier this month, talking about the need to be more responsible as global citizens and to develop a social license. I think everybody in Alberta knows that we receive a significant discount on our natural resources on the global market. And as much as I'm a solar guy, I'm also an Albertan, and this frustrates me. And I think we need to, as a province, ensure that if we are going to be pulling things out of the ground and selling it off elsewhere, we need to ensure we get proper market value for it so that we can reinvest those funds in cleaner, more diverse infrastructure for our province. Because this is what our province looks like today. We generate more than half of the GHG emissions of from the electricity sector in Canada, which is obviously pretty significant. And when we consider that we have a population that's a third the size of Ontario, and we generate more than 3 times the GHGs from electricity production, it's an issue. And we have a huge coal fleet that is causing significant issue, and in my perspective, in my impression, in my opinion, generates significant health issues for the future. I have a 5-week-old son, a 2.5-year-old son, and I don't want them growing up in a world where we are the worst polluter in Canada by far. This was Alberta's plan, how we can reduce our GHGs, and the majority of it came from CCS, carbon capture and storage. 2 of the 4 plants that have been announced have since been canceled. So CCS is looking like it's not going to be at least at this time with current technology, have the ability to reduce our GHGs the way we had hoped. So we need to look at other solutions. And I don't believe that solar is the option, but it's part of the solution. Right? There's no single option that is going to get us to the point where we are polluting significantly less, but it's a combination of a number of technologies. I think CCS absolutely plays a role, but solar does as well. The last one is infrastructure renewal. This is Conference Board of Canada, $294 billion in new electricity sector upgrades. It's a reasonably significant amount of money. We have 17 coal-fired plants that are supposed to close in the next 15 to 20 years. I wish they closed a lot sooner, but with the 50-year extension, 50-year life allowance that has been granted, we'll have potentially coal in Alberta until at least 2060, which 2062, I think, maybe 2063. So that's problematic if we're trying to reduce consumption of dirty electrons. Same thing, BC, we've got some hydro rate increases that are coming that are being strongly opposed on the provincial level. So, all this to say, it doesn't matter the individual specifics, but significant infrastructure upgrades. So we need renewables to be a large portion of this. But to allow this to happen, and renewables generally have challenges, they're intermittent, they're a little bit more expensive, we need to figure out how to manage that. We need public opinion, public support, because we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we do need to pay more if we want renewable generation. And we need to be able to make that choice. And I think it's fully justifiable, we'll see that later in the presentation. But this was just some polling that's been done recently by Harris Decima and by Innovative Research Group, talking about support for renewable, support for solar, and there's more of this that will come out through some of the research, but notionally, Canadians are very supportive of renewable generation. The challenge comes to, at what point are people willing to pay for it? And there's some public polling done in Ontario that isn't reflected here that was talking about exactly that elasticity, that price elasticity. So are you willing to pay 5% more? Yes. Are you willing to pay 10% more? Generally, yes. Once you get to 20, 30, 40% more, people are less keen to say, yes, I'll pay more. But what's missing from a lot of this is the true cost of our current electricity generation, because I argue it's a lot more than what we're paying today, and it comes in through things like healthcare costs. So there's some kind of early view on some of this stuff. There'll be more discussion on this next week at Solar West. So some of these slides this is the first time they've been shown. You'll see a lot more detail when the reports come out at the end of October, as well as the discussions next week. But the first session of next week's conference is to talk very specifically about policy frameworks and infrastructure opportunities in Alberta, and what the Alberta government is doing on their alternative renewable energy framework, how that plays in with the industry, and what we can kind of expect. Okay, so we talked about global growth, we talked about some of the policy drivers in Alberta, and I mentioned earlier some of the challenges that we're seeing in Europe, where we have a lot of electrons on the grid from solar and wind that needs to figure out how to manage. And what this has changed is a lot of global PV markets are going away from a generation-based incentive to a differentiated rate whereby what you export to the grid is worth less than what you consume, because they don't want more electrons on the grid, they just want smarter ones. And so what we used to see was, okay, how much roof space do you have? Well, let's fill the entire thing with solar and generate as much as we can and sell all that. What we're seeing now is a more optimized approach where we match production from a PV system to the consumption of a building. So it's a much more educated and sophisticated process and sale. And I would argue that this is what we should be doing, or this is what we are doing and have to do right now in Alberta to have solar make sense in the current frameworks. Currently, under the microgeneration regulations in Alberta, you're allowed to install a PV system that provides you up to net zero electricity bill at the end of the year, or at least net zero electricity consumption, meaning that you can export some months and import other months, but on the whole, throughout the year, you average out to, you can't be a net exporter, or you're not supposed to be a net exporter. The challenge is that electricity that you consume is costing more than the electricity you export. So it's a very similar issue to Germany, because you have your electricity rate. And if you ask someone on the street what they pay for electricity, they probably say 9 cents or 8 cents, because I have a great deal from Max and I get 8 cents for the next 5 years. But if you look at their bill, they pay a lot more than 8 cents, right? You've got your transmission, distribution, you've got your delivery, you've got all these things. And by the way, that's going to go up a little bit when we start advertising 14 billion in transmission lines. So the energy that you offset through consumption is worth a lot more than that you export. If anybody's interested in how to calculate the levelized cost of electricity, here it is, and it gives you a cost per kilowatt hour. But what influences it? There we go. This. So LCOE is a combination of a number of different factors, including what your financing costs are, what your operation and maintenance costs are, what your system price is, what your specific yield is, so how much electricity are you generating from your system per kilowatt of installed, which, by the way, in Alberta, you generate a lot, and I'll show that. But your levelized cost of electricity is this meant to show that it's not easy to come up with a number that makes sense, because everybody has different parameters. And if we were to argue, there are some instances where LCOE are significantly lower than others, and the installations may only be, 2 blocks away from one another, because people have very different financial considerations or production profiles. So what I've tried to do here is look at LCOE in different areas. So here's Germany, the market that has the most installed capacity of solar in the world, at 50% of their global or their energy consumption on June 6th of this year. Here's North Africa, one of the second places in the world, and here's Alberta that sits in the middle. So as you can see, we have significantly more solar resource, or significantly better solar resource than we would see in Germany, and for that matter, a lot of Europe, and obviously less in North Africa. But here's where it stands. So I was in Fort McMurray last week before, looking at some projects. They're around 1,100 kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak, meaning that if you install 1 kilowatt of solar, you'll generate 1,100 kilowatt hours per year, or in that first year. All the way up to called Medicine Hat, that is close to the 1,400 mark, which is comparable with parts of Africa. So it's an amazing resource in Alberta. And the other interesting thing about solar that most people don't realize is it actually performs better at colder temperatures. As you increase temperature, the IV curves change, you actually have an efficiency factor loss, and you have more conduction losses. So the days when it's minus 30 and clear and sunny in Alberta are some of the best generation days for solar, at least during those peak generation windows. If we look at the installed costs of solar, I showed this slide before, kind of where we're at as far as kind of general ranges. Maybe it creeps up a bit higher than this, but somewhere in the $1.75 to $3.25, maybe $4 watt range. So if we look at a large project that we can do, we as in the industry can do large scale solar installs, $1.82 a watt is pretty reasonable. With financing rates, and these are pretty aggressive, but a 5.2% on a discount rate, and reasonable O&M assumptions, that's 13 cents a kilowatt hour, levelized cost over 20 years. So it's a little bit higher than the pool price today of somewhere between 6 and 9 cents on the wholesale market, but it's pretty close. And a few years ago, it would be 3 times that. Even if you look at commercial rooftop type installations, $2.50, $3. And sorry, the reason that these are $1.82 and $2.43 is because, again, this chart is in euros and trying to do conversion, just trying to make it simple to make sure our lines intersected. But again, 16 cents per kilowatt hour, which by the way is less than a lot of people pay for electricity in Alberta. So we're at the point where if you have the right system, you can be in the money today for the cost of solar versus the cost of electricity from the grid. But the right system requires some different load profile, which I'll show in a few minutes. So prices come down a lot. It needs to come down more. The challenge is that equipment costs can't really go much lower. So we showed this price of solar modules. It was $4 and $2.80. A 50% reduction in solar module cost is 40 cents a watt now, 50 cents a watt, whatever it is. It's not an amount that's going to cause a huge difference. This chart shows the difference between solar installed costs in Germany versus the US. And the equipment costs are virtually identical. There are some slight changes because of the code and some of the things that are required, like allowing higher voltage installations in Europe. But the biggest difference comes from areas, and I apologize, it's blurry. I should have had a more higher resolution image. But you see the profit stack, so profit's the same. It's good. It means we're still making some money in Europe. Sales tax is sales tax. But things like overhead, customer acquisition, permitting, all of these things make up significantly less than what we'd see for a similar installation in the US. Now, anytime someone puts up charts and graphs and statistics, it's easy to influence information one way or the other. So I would probably argue that maybe the German solar costs are a bit low here, and the US solar costs are a bit high. But in general, the story is the same. The soft costs to do solar projects in North America are significantly higher than what they are in Europe. A lot of it has to do with scale and ease of process and efficiency. So if you have an installation crew that can go and run steady for the entire year, and you can have a racking specialist, and he moves from house to house, and you can have a module specialist, and you have an electrician, and these guys just go, and all they do is install, then you can be a lot more efficient and effective and bring that cost significantly lower. So we have huge opportunities to do that, but it's not going to come from equipment cost going forward. A little bit will come from equipment cost, but metal costs what it is metal, or what it costs what it costs. Copper costs what it costs. So the majority of it needs to come from soft costs. And this is the first time that I've been in the industry where the soft costs of installation, so overhead, installation, profit, these things are less than equipment costs. It's the first time that's ever been the case. Solar modules on their own used to be $4 a watt. Now we do installs for under $2 on a large enough project. So we need to make sure we get those efficiencies, which means we need scale. And that's one of the drivers for requiring policy in the province or anywhere that we want to see more adoption. It's because we don't get scale until there is a financial value proposition for the majority of customers. Okay, so let's step back a little bit and look at why this makes sense for Alberta. This is a graph of the pool prices in Alberta over the last number of years. This is the average pool price. This is the wholesale price, so not what you pay for electricity, but what your retailer may pay for electricity before they sell it to you. And you can see it's hugely volatile year over year, based on different conditions in the grid, demand, load, these types of things. It averages somewhere around $65 to $70 a megawatt hour, so that's 6.5 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. This is a graph that I pulled from the May 2013 report from the National Energy Board showing the peak load. So this is the average throughout the day, throughout the month, and this is the peak. So there are times in the day when we hit $200 a megawatt hour or 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and we have different generation sources that support this versus our traditional base load. The graph on the bottom is Ontario, so you can see they're a little more consistent in their peaking, where we have these huge spikes day over day, month over month. And so it happens that solar actually plays a very nice role in evening out some of these spikes. So the blue line is, and this is again more information that will come in the report soon, but the blue line is the average hourly price in 2012, and the yellow bars is the solar production profile. And so things overlay quite nicely. As we end up with increasing prices in Alberta and increasing demand, our solar production profile actually peaks out nicely. What we don't hit is the 6 o'clock news spike that we have in Alberta right now. But we have a huge ability to level out some of the early part of this with some demand management and some conservation and some other measures, and maybe we can bring down that last little tail. But we do solve part of the problem today. So what does that mean for our grid? Well, this line is the average pool price. And then that line is the pool price during solar generation hours over the last couple of years. And what I found interesting when looking at this is in 2009, solar was 126% of pool price, and then it was 138, and then it was 144, and then it's 149. So we're ending with this widening gap that each year, at least over the last 4 years, solar has become more and more valuable than the regular electricity on the grid today. And part of this may be fluke, part of it may be some outages that happen in the summer when solar is producing, but solar has been consistently more valuable and getting more valuable than regular electricity on the grid. So if that's the case, is our grid designed wrong? Right? If we are at the point where prices aren't increasing that much, but our peak prices are increasing more, and that our daytime prices are increasing more, do we have the wrong generation mix? Maybe we have too much coal, do we have peakers that are operating efficiently, do we have market dynamics that aren't working properly? And there's different challenges there. And from a policy perspective in Alberta, that's a challenge as well, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what does all this mean, pool price versus retail price? In the near future, I truly believe that solar is going to be competitive on a pool price basis. So at some point, when we need more new generation and solar costs continue to come down, solar may be, and I think will be, the choice for wholesale generation on large scale. Today, there are two very particular areas where solar is cost competitive, straight out of the box. One is on large remote power applications using diesel. I'll show a quick example of that. But the other one is on some industrial or commercial type applications where they have high load and they do pay high costs. We showed an LCOE of 16 cents per kilowatt hour as achievable. There are industrial consumers with a load profile that works very well for solar that pay more than that today. So they can already see a cost savings. And now there are finance mechanisms available in the market that allow for cash flow day one. So you as a building owner could have someone install a solar system for you, and you're paying less for electricity today than you were yesterday. And that's a big change in the space. However, it needs to be the perfect building, the perfect orientation, the perfect load profile. There's just a lot of things that need to line up. So it still makes up a very small percentage of the available market. And people don't know. When I was in Fort McMurray a week and a half ago, we sat down and talked to some people about solar, and they said, yeah, we looked at solar, but our consultant said it's expensive. Oh, great. Well, let's talk about this. So what's expensive to you? And so you're talking numbers. And the numbers that are out there are 30%, 40%, 100% higher than where costs are today. Because if you haven't looked at solar this month, you thought it was expensive last month and the month before, because things have been changing so drastically. So we've come to the point now where it's no longer expensive. I'll do a bit of an aside, because this is part of the reason to go up north, was to look at remote power, mini grid. A lot of facilities, or communities, as well as mining facilities, camps, these types of things, run off of diesel generators in Canada. There's a staggering number of them. And there are technologies now that allow for very easy integration into diesel. Generally works better for larger scale, but here's a situation where you've got a 4-generator diesel bank all tied in through a load center. And there are technologies out there today, this one in this case from SMA, that will tie into the generator line, or the gensets, and supplement the load such that you can run a solar system to offset the consumption from this generator and this generator. Perhaps you only have 2 out of the 4 running, or 1 out of the 4 running as opposed to 4 out of the 4 running, which means less fuel cost and a extended life on your generators because of lower run times. There are different infrastructures, and here's another similar setup. This is just a graph or a chart that the IEA put together. The same thing, different distributed generation sources tied into some type of gas turbines or remote generation. So I started looking at this over the last 6 months and where costs land, what it looks like, and I put together a quick financial model for the purposes of the presentation. And these are very, very basic assumptions and very conservative assumptions. So at 35 cents per kilowatt hour for fuel cost and a $3 per watt solar installed cost, it's very typical O&M insurance. You can see building owners, plant owners can save or have a system that produces a 12.5% return and a 7-year payback, not even considering what the future capital cost offsets are going to be. And 35 cents a kilowatt hour is cheap. And you go to a lot of these places and they're paying 50 cents or $1 or what, and how difficult it is to access. So there are true opportunities available today in a lot of these areas where solar can have immediate impact and immediate savings on things like work camps, mining operations, remote communities. The challenge is getting them to a scale where you can actually get the installed cost down. The other challenge in Canada is as we move farther north, where a lot of these communities and these setups are, is we have a very differentiated load profile versus production profile. So in the summer we generate great solar resource, in the winter we don't generate much. So it doesn't affect their entire full year as much as they'd like, but there's huge offsets and savings available today. And I think we'll see more and more of these starting to happen. We're starting to see a significant number of installations in the far north. And so we expect to see this market grow significantly as well. So in very specific situations, solar is cost competitive today, but we need support to ensure they can be cost competitive on a broader basis so that we can really build that industry. I talked about self-consumption, why it's important. This is a presentation from our engineering team in Germany. They were talking about autarky, which I had no idea what it meant until a few months ago when I sat down and someone tried to educate me. But essentially it's self-sufficiency. So how much can I generate? Self-consumption is how much do I consume internally, and self-sufficiency is how much of the electricity that I use comes from solar on a percentage basis. And this is becoming more important in Europe, and it will become more important in solar markets globally. But this is self-consumption generally, right? What I consume or what I produce goes into my home, and I don't export much to the grid, because in Europe this is worth 15 to 20 cents, euro cents per kilowatt hour. When I export it's 8 to 15, so I want to use as much of my home as possible. But it's challenging because you have a couple of options. You can either decrease your system size so you don't export, or you can use load management, which seems pretty straightforward, it's easy enough to do. Because this is what the load management for most homes or load consumption for most residences look like. You've got PCs, you've got TV, you've got drawing, and again, for us, we turn on the light switch and lights come on, right? We just expect it to work. We don't have smart meters, we don't have time of day pricing. I don't, even in the space, really think about when I wash my dishes or when I dry my clothes. And this is something that we do need to address as an industry, and I don't mean the solar industry, I just mean as our general industry. We need to be able to figure out how to manage our load profiles. We need to know when we're consuming and when we should be doing something a little bit different. And then the other thing that really changes the game and that is coming on is storage systems, right? So energy management paired with storage, now we can go from self-consumption levels that are quite low for residential. It's very seldom that people have a consumption profile that matches the solar profile, because generally you're at work when it's producing. So we don't have the most efficient setup for ensuring that we're using electricity at the right times. And energy management systems are still a ways away. So this is our estimation of when we'll see more energy management systems deployed. And so here's the timeline, here's the type of technologies that'll come on, and here's our estimate of the cost curve. So where we sit today, $1,000, $1,300 a megawatt hour, or a kilowatt hour rather, it's expensive. It's not something that you can do today quite easily. But we get up to $250 a kilowatt hour, and it's very easy to do. But we're not there yet, and it's going to take some time. But we're starting to see more and more interest and development there. And as I mentioned earlier, Germany is actually providing financial incentives for people to install energy management systems in their homes and battery systems in their homes, so that they can get to this point, so they can manage what's on the grid. And then here's the autarky level. So where we are today, we can get to 35% reasonably on residential. In a couple of years with some better storage, we get to 55%. As we get some more efficient storage, again, 65%, we can get more self-reliant on a PV system plus storage and less reliant on the grid. And that has huge implications on our existing electricity infrastructure. These $14 billion in power lines for transmission that we're spending now, plus some more in the future, plus the existing utility business model. The way that Epcor recovers, any retailer recovers a lot of their costs is through distribution of electricity to your home. And if you're using less and less electricity in your home, that means you're paying less and less distribution, transmission, these types of things. So we need to find other ways to advertise your assets, which causes a bigger issue. But back to this is what we need to start seeing happen more of. And this is a program that we developed in Europe, but here is the consumption of the facility. Here is the production profile of solar. How do we optimize that setup? How do we compare things like self-consumption versus autarky and trying to find an efficiency curve that makes the most sense for the market? And this will be very different for every market based on the financial conditions. How do we look at IRR versus overall returns? These are some of the things that we need to get smarter about as an industry to look at how do we get more effective at deploying systems in the markets that they make sense. I talked a little bit about Ontario. We do a lot of business in Ontario because of the feed-in tariff. For the feed-in tariff, we show up at someone's building, we see how much solar we put on the roof, and that's the system size we recommend, because that's what's going to generate the most for that facility and be the most cost efficient. Whereas in other markets, like what's in Europe, and the way solar works in Alberta today, we actually need to do a much more detailed analysis on electricity consumption versus solar production and try and overlay where it makes the most sense. And feed-in tariffs are much easier to work with. They're a lot faster to deploy technology, and my opinion is it'd be a great solution for Alberta. But if it's not the right solution for Alberta, because we don't like feed-in tariffs, and we have an energy market and things like this, may make more sense for Alberta. So again, if the conditions are right, large-scale microgeneration projects are in the money today. Load profile, fixed solar production profile, site has sufficient ability to support PV without any upgrades. This is another significant issue. In this project, there's about $30,000 in structural upgrades to different areas of the roof to make sure it can support it. That obviously changed the financials drastically. And then the building owner or the site owner has to be able to commit for at least 15 years, probably closer to 20, just to amortize the cost effectively. So solar makes sense today if everything is perfect. But most projects we look at, they're not. And because everything has to be perfect, the customer acquisition costs are quite high. But again, and this is more a conversation on the political policy side, if we have policy that's going to push solar forward, it doesn't take long before we get back to something that sustains itself without any kind of subsidy level. So before I go into some closing comments, I wanted to put this study up. And as I mentioned earlier with the other graphs that I showed, it's easy to make graphs show the information you want it to show based on your assumptions that go into it. But I found this one interesting. This is a study that was published for one of the solar energy societies in the northeast of the US. And it's titled, you can Google this, the value of distributed solar electricity generation to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And what they tried to do is quantify the value of all these different things. Fuel cost savings, O&M, security enhancement value, T&D capacity value, and they tried to stack up. And what they came up with was this stack, or this in a kind of chart form or an Excel file, and ranging anywhere from $256 per megawatt hour to $318 a megawatt hour, which is between, let's convert that back, it's 26 cents a kilowatt hour to 32 cents a kilowatt hour, is what they felt the value of solar was, including, like say, environmental value and some of these other things, to the grid in that area. Their electricity prices are much different than ours today. If we look at the fuel cost savings, they're kind of in that same range, right? 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So the assumption that these guys came, or the conclusion they came through with, was solar makes a ton of sense today, and you'd be ridiculous to install anything but solar because it makes the most sense of everything today. And this is what they've been trying to use some of the information to help move policy and infrastructure forward in those states. But solar is one of the only technologies that can, I'd say in Alberta, have a higher value to the pool than any other electricity source that's out there today, except for maybe natural gas peaking plants, but they're not all that clean. Have the environmental benefits, have the distributed benefit, have the benefit of, again, this one-for-one concept where if you need 5 megs of generation here, you build 5 megs of generation there, and you build 10 megs over here. You don't build 150 megs here and then run a power line in across the province. Or as much as I think it's great that NMAC's building the 800 megawatt Shepherd facility, again, transmission infrastructure has to support that. And by the way, we have an aging generation fleet in Canada and Alberta that needs to be replaced, a lot of it from coal. So how are we going to fill that? I think there are smarter ways to do it. One of the arguments for solar in Eastern Canada, and specifically Ontario, is they have choices right now of, do we refurbish nuclear, which is very politically contentious and hugely expensive, although the nuclear industry would argue differently, or do we do something else? They had gas plants that they just had to take out of Oakville and pay whatever, $900 million or $1 billion in LDs for and move them somewhere else. They need generation. One of the things that solar does, and I think it's quite interesting, the longer you can wait to make a generation decision, the more information you have. Call it option value. Right? So you have more information next year than you do this year about what the industry is going to look like. We're building, again, I'll go back to the infrastructure upgrades on our electricity system. Once we build out these 14 billion transmission lines, it's going to be about 30% more transmission than we need. But at some point, the thought is we'll need that transmission. But what if we don't need that transmission? What if 10 years from now, everything's different? What if we have a situation where solar on a rooftop, plus a storage system in the basement, plus some type of CHP, combined heat and power in your basement, has the effect of not requiring the same transmission infrastructure that we have today? Then what do we do with the billions that are there now, plus the 14 billion that we're going to add? If we can delay our decision 5 years to see what happens with technology, that's worth a lot. So all that to say is solar in some areas of Canada are providing that option value, where if we can install 10 megs of solar and delay generation infrastructure by a couple of years, it's worth a lot, because in those 2 years, we'll learn a lot more about what the market's going to look like in the future. The AESO has an exceptionally challenging job. I had the pleasure the last couple of days to chair the Alberta Power Symposium in Calgary, and heard from a number of people at the AESO talking about their future price forecasts, their future generation forecasts, load profile forecasts, and it's not an easy job, right? You've got all these different scenarios. So if we end up with interprovincial and North American pipelines running out of business, out of the country, province rather, plus being able to ship natural gas out through Kitimat, we have electricity demand that goes through the roof, assuming that oil prices stay where it is and everything else. If we can build that generation, then we have a slightly lower oil price, or a slightly lower electricity price, because there's less consumption, we're not shipping as much oil out. If we end up with significant environmental restrictions or costs on carbon, then we have different scenarios. If we end up with load contraction and huge conservation measures, we have different assumptions. So they've got teams of people just dedicated to scenario planning on the what ifs. And again, if we can help them delay those what ifs and get more information before then you can make better decisions, and better decisions that we may not, as a province, have to pay for the next 7 years. Anyways, that's a bit of my rant. Going back to why solar is going to be a part of it. So we talked about a lot of this today. Solar's seen significant growth across the world. It's getting cheaper, it's getting easier to install, it's getting more efficient. Prices are decreasing at an astonishing rate, but they're kind of leveling out now. We've got to take out the soft costs. LCOE for solar in Alberta today makes sense in very specific applications, but it makes sense today. And this is the first time, again, in my career I've ever been able to say this, that we can sell some people electricity less than they pay today. Diesel offset is a no-brainer. There's systems out there with a 15-year life that that can integrate solar. This is a no-brainer. It should happen every time, but the industry is unaware, and it's going to take some education to get to that point. Solar is probably the most valuable type of electricity on the grid today. That obviously may change as penetration ratios change, but today, I don't know of any electricity on the grid other than a natural gas peaking facility that is more valuable from a power pole price rate. And again, we talked about the cost reductions, but really revolutions need to come in energy management systems to really allow us to get to really exciting and deep penetrations of renewables. And what we just talked about at length was this whole real value in incremental load growth and offset for future system planning. We can learn a lot more before we have to build infrastructure. We'll spend $300 billion over the next 20 years. We get to have more information before we spend that $300 billion. And the very last thing, again, as an Albertan, if we're going to be pulling oil and natural gas out of the ground, I want to make sure we get paid for it. I don't think solar is going to be the only reason we need to get Keystone and Gateway and everything else approved, but it's not going to hurt. And by the way, it provides huge value for the province. So we need some type of policy framework. The government's been working on this for some time. I think we're getting close. It's been a high level of engagement. I hope that we see it sooner than later, because I think it's long overdue, and we have both an obligation as responsible citizens and a real opportunity to take advantage of that. So we need to see that. We need to see streamlined permitting processes. We need to be able to go from city to city and have the same process everywhere you go to make sure that, again, as we try to affect soft costs, it's easy to do business and easy to make these things happen and safe and reliable. And then lastly, we haven't talked about this a lot yet, but there needs to be a recognition and adoption or adaptation of utility business models as we see more behind the meter installations. If we end up with a future where a large percentage of Albertans have much lower load because they have their own on-site generation, they have some type of on-site storage, how do utilities continue to operate a profitable business? How does a wire owner recover their capital costs if they don't have anybody using those wires? And this is one of the real challenges we're seeing in Europe right now, is when you've got a day like June 6th, when there's 50% or more electricity from solar on the grid, those utilities aren't getting paid their former variable costs. And so we're starting to see things like standby charges and availability charges and a complete change to the business model. But why not get into the business somehow? We get more involved in the space, own assets, sell assets, be a part of the industry, develop projects, and not just fight it, but actually participate in it. I think there's a real opportunity for a smarter utility business model where demand management, smart meters, renewable energy, all these things are part of a business model that allows for more sustainability than just owning some wires that carry electricity to homes, because that may not be the future we have. Now, we'll caveat all of that and a lot of this energy management stuff with the fact that 80% of the load in Alberta, 80% is not distributed, right? And 80% of the load is from our large consumers, and less than 20% is on the residential and commercial side. So we are a little bit different than a lot of areas where we do have a significant industrial load that just continues to need to be served, but we have a significant amount that doesn't, and this is going to have a significant effect on that. So, I talked fast, I apologize for that. We went through a lot of different information, a lot of it that maybe didn't necessarily tie together, but there was a question asked to me earlier today around, what's my vision for solar in the next 5 years, and I don't know, honestly, I don't know what it's going to look like in Alberta. I want to see in Alberta where we don't have 50% of the GHG emissions from the electricity sector coming from our province in Canada, where that should be a number drastically lower. We have huge opportunity, we have huge natural resources, and we are a global energy superpower, but we are so far behind on renewable policy that it's starting to pass us by, and so we need to really reinvigorate that conversation and make sure we're making the right decisions today, because again, the generation transmission infrastructure that we're putting in today have 30 to 70 year life cycles, so we need to make sure we're making the right decisions today.